I used to let thought loops control me all the time. However, once I learned a little bit more about how OCD, thought loops, and anxiety work a little better, not only was I able to drastically reduce the impact that anxiety had on my life, but I was also able to stop other habits like binge eating, smoking, and drinking caffeine on a regular basis. In this video, we're going to go over the techniques that I learned and the understanding and insight that I gained around anxiety so that you can have the same exact effect in your life. You no longer have to be dominated and conquered by your anxiety on a day-to-day basis, and you can learn to break free and step away from the toxic thought loops and patterns that keep you stuck in the same exact place day after day. This video is going to be broken up into two parts. In the first video, we're going to get an understanding of how does anxiety work, how does OCD work, how do thought loops work, and why do we get stuck in them? Why are they so enticing, and why is it so hard to pull ourselves out of those patterns of thinking when we find ourselves in them? The second part of the video will actually focus on breaking free from that anxiety, breaking free from those thought loops. And the thing is that the first part of the video, just gaining the insight into what's actually going on in your brain, will be extremely helpful and beneficial, and without that, you can't really understand the practical tips. So I urge you to watch the whole video all the way through. Don't just skip straight to the practical tips section, because without understanding how anxiety actually works in your brain, you won't be able to apply any of the practical tips that we talk about in the second part of this video. So without further ado, let's dive into the first part. So how exactly does anxiety work? So basically, the way that you can think about it is anxiety is all about, and OCD, all of these kind of, anxiety related disorders are all about finding a problem and then becoming obsessed with kind of solving that problem. Basically, how everyone's brain works, right, is that you'll have some kind of thing come up in your life. Something will happen, and then your brain, may or may not register it as a problem. Now, let's say your brain interprets something that happened as a problem, right? Let's say that you got into a car crash. That's obviously going to be something that most people's brains would determine as a problem. So you have a problem. Now, the second step is your brain starts to give you some kind of feeling in order to motivate you to solve the problem. And very often that feeling is anxiety, or some kind of stress, some kind of tension or pressure in order to motivate you to solve that problem. As Mark Manson talks about in his book, which I'm going to pop up on screen right here, emotions are what drive us. Without emotions, we can't actually do anything. All of our actions, everything we do is driven by emotion. And anxiety or stress, any kind of tension, is an extremely powerful emotion. Why? Because we don't want to feel it. That's what makes anxiety so powerful. And that's why our brain uses anxiety pretty often. And a lot of the times, this is actually really healthy and helpful. When we're in a bad situation, again, like a car crash, or we're in some kind of danger, anxiety is an incredibly important and helpful feeling, because it'll give us that drive to get out of there, to get to safety, and it'll help us resolve an issue that needs to be resolved as soon as possible. The reason that people with anxiety or anxiety disorders struggle so much with this basic kind of way that our brain works is that their brains are kind of on overdrive when it comes to finding problems in their life. There's one of two things that will typically happen. They'll either find a problem that doesn't exist, they'll label something as a problem that isn't actually a problem, or B, what they'll find themselves doing is they'll try to push themselves to immediately resolve an issue that cannot be resolved immediately and needs to take time and effort to just kind of wait it out. We can kind of think of common examples of both of these. When it comes to problems that aren't really there, you can think of a lot of things with OCD are actually just problems that aren't actually there, A lot of people with OCD have irrational thoughts, irrational beliefs, and I'm not knocking anyone with OCD. I have OCD, so I'm saying this with pure experience. All of the OCD thoughts you have are completely irrational, and all the beliefs that you develop are completely irrational, but you're finding problems where there aren't any problems there, because your brain is a problem-solving machine. It's designed to find things to fix. So that's kind of an issue there. And then when it comes to problems that you can't actually resolve right now, this is kind of more day-to-day. You can see this a lot with, people who might be very nervous or worrying a lot about things that they can't control, or that they need time to kind of wait out. A common example of this is waiting to get your grades back for a test. People who are, people might get a little stressed, might get a little worried, but it might not impact their day-to-day lives. But people with anxiety will get completely swallowed up by the thought of what grade did I get? How well did I do? If you're waiting for maybe a performance review at your job, you're constantly thinking about when is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? And you can't do anything until it happens. It's because, again, there's a problem, right? You want to know what your grade is, or what your score was on a performance review. You want to know if things are going to be okay, and you want to know if you need to act or if you need to do anything. But the issue is that you can't actually move forward. There is an actual problem there in your life, like getting a bad grade, getting a bad performance review, potentially losing your job. These are all scary things, and it makes sense that you want to try and solve those things and make it so that those bad things don't happen. But again, in that moment, you can't do anything until the actual event arrives, until you actually get your grade back, until you actually get the performance review back, you can't actually do anything. So in both of these cases, there is a problem that your brain has found, and it's giving you an intense emotion to motivate you to solve it, but you can't solve the problem, either because it doesn't exist, or B, the problem is there, can't actually be solved in the current moment. And when it comes to problems that don't exist either, let's say that you do solve some kind of superficial problem that isn't really an issue. A lot of people with anxiety will get really caught up about really small things. Maybe their room is slightly disheveled. For me, I know that if my pencil is slightly off in my room, I'll get really annoyed and I'll need to fix it. I'll need everything in place exactly in order, exactly how it's supposed to be. The thing is, even if you solve that still doesn't get to the root cause, because if you keep finding problems in your life that aren't actually problems, guess what? You're never gonna stop finding problems that aren't problems. The issue is not the problems in your life, but it's the fact that you keep searching for problems to solve and finding problems where there aren't there. It is the actual finding of the problems as the problem, not the problems themselves, which is something that a lot of people with anxiety never seem to notice. If you talk to people who are frequent worriers, they can never really fully grasp that the problem is not everything else around them, but the problem is that they keep worrying about things. People who are constantly anxious just think like, oh, I don't know how he can be so carefree when there's so much to worry about. But the thing is, if there's always a lot to worry about for you, that might be because you are the one constantly worrying, not because you're in a worrisome environment. Because oftentimes people, who grew up with lots of anxiety were in a dangerous environment and they did have to worry a lot. But even when they're out of that environment, they continue worrying, and that's where the survival mechanism becomes maladaptive. So now that we kind of basically understand the premise of anxiety, or how it kind of works in the brain, we need to go a little bit deeper and understand how do our thoughts actually behave when we're stuck in a thought loop, or we're stuck in kind of an OCD rumination where we keep thinking the same thing over and over and we keep performing the same compulsions. There are two things that we're going to discuss, concepts that I've pulled from these two books that I'm going to show up on screen right now. The first one we're going to go over is kind of this idea of trigger, behavior, reward from the book Unwinding Anxiety. The way that this book kind of frames anxiety is that it basically goes like this. You have some kind of trigger, you have some kind of behavior, and you have some kind of reward. So let's go over how this applies to our current understanding of anxiety, right? The trigger is that we find a problem, right? We find some kind of thing that's going wrong in our life, or we have something that causes us to have some kind of anxiety. That's the trigger, right? That's the first part. The second part is the behavior, and the behavior typically is thinking about it, right? We'll have some kind of issue. Let's say that the trigger is some kind of health thing. We have some kind of pain in our chest. That's the trigger that causes anxiety. The behavior then becomes to go online and Google every single possible thing that we can about this pain in our chest and self-diagnose ourselves within the next 2 hours. That is the behavior. And the reward is, you might be kind of surprised to hear this, but oftentimes the reward is more anxiety, right? So now that I've said that, right, trigger, behavior, reward, why is it that we keep on doing these same behaviors when the reward is anxiety? That doesn't really sound very exciting, right? Because a lot of other habits, if you look at them, follow the same exact pattern: trigger, behavior, reward. And a lot of these patterns are actually extremely rewarding, especially if you look at things like drug use, right? Like drug use, you have some kind of stressor, maybe you get stressed at work, there's an argument, you have a trigger, the behavior is to use the drug, and then the reward is that typically for a lot of drug users in their early drug use, they feel extremely good and they feel a lot better, right? That's why drug use is so hard to put down, is because the more rewarding a behavior is, the more likely we are to continue doing it. So when we think about it in that way, why do we keep on engaging in anxiety when the reward is more anxiety a lot of the time? There's two reasons for this. One reason is that A, we don't actually recognize that the end result of our trigger and behavior is more anxiety, and B, sometimes the anxiety actually gives us a good reward, which is a solution or a sense of relief, but only sometimes. Now, think real quick about what else that's extremely addicting, that doesn't give you a reward a lot of the time, but occasionally it will give you a reward and it'll want you to keep on going over and over. And if you happen to get slot machines, you're exactly right, because anxiety is a lot like slot machines. See, the thing is, you'll have a trigger, you'll have your behavior, maybe compulsively over researching or thinking about it over and over and thinking about different scenarios and different solutions. But what's the reality, right? Sometimes when you're thinking and you're anxious, it actually helps helps you, right? You'll actually come up with a solution. You'll actually get something done, or you'll feel a little bit of relief. And especially in OCD, this is true, right? We'll have our trigger, that intrusive thought, that feeling of anxiety, that something bad's gonna happen, right? We do our compulsive behavior, and then sometimes we'll feel better, right? We'll feel actually a little bit calmer, right? That's why we keep on doing it. And the fact that it's intermittent, right? That's what we call an intermittent reward. Sometimes it's rewarding and sometimes it's not. That's what makes it so addictive and hard to stop, because we never know when the overthinking is going to be helpful or not. So we feel like we have to do it every time. And that's why slot machines are so addictive, right? Every single time you pull, you don't know what you're going to get, but sometimes you win really big, right? You actually get a lot of money. And so you keep on playing over and over because you don't want to miss out on that next chance to make more and more money. And with this framework in mind, we can also look at a different framework that specifically looks at OCD and intrusive thoughts, and you can also apply some of it to anxiety as well. And this framework revolves around kind of two voices in your head. You have a worrying voice and then a false comfort voice, right? This kind of follows the same exact pattern of that trigger behavior response, but it's framed in a slightly different way that's more specific to OCD. So first, you'll have some kind of intrusive thought, right? That's the trigger. First, you'll get scared, you'll get uncomfortable, something will make you feel a little bit anxious, right? Then the behavior is that you have a worry voice, right? That worry voice says something like, oh, what does this say about me? I just thought about kicking that dog. What does this say about me? You know, this says something bad about me. This says that I'm a horrible person. This says that, you know, something's wrong, whatever. It'll have some kind of worry thought. Oh no, what does this mean, right? Then the other thought that comes up in your mind is the false comfort. And the false comfort says, oh no, that's fine. Don't worry. There's nothing bad going on. And then your reward is that you feel a little bit better. But then as soon as your false comfort voice kind of says something, right? The worry voice comes back on and says, oh, but what about this? And your false comfort voice says, well, no, that's okay because this. And then this voice comes on again, the worry voice, oh no, what about this though? And then you kind of have this back and forth, and it'll go constantly, you know, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth inside of your head, and it'll spiral out of control, and you won't be able to kind of manage your anxiety. That's why this voice is called false comfort, because it doesn't actually comfort you. It doesn't actually make things any better. What it does is it's kind of following that trigger behavior response pattern. First, you have that trigger of that intrusive thought, that anxiety, something is going on. Then you have the behavior of worrying about it and then finding a solution to it. And sometimes you actually do calm yourself down a little bit. You see a decline in anxiety. But again, most of the time, the reward is actually an increase in stress, right? Anyone knows with OCD, right? The more you perform your compulsions, the more you try to reassure yourself, the worse your anxiety gets. But the thing is, the reason we keep trying to reassure ourselves is because sometimes it does work, right? Sometimes false comfort actually does provide comfort, right? That's why we keep on doing it over and over. It's not for no reason, you know? People aren't crazy. They keep doing things because sometimes they work. And with OCD, with anxiety, we so desperately want something that'll make us feel better that we'll be willing to do anything, you know, even if it only works sometimes in order to get some relief. So now that we kind of understand this first fundamental part, right, of this trigger behavior response pattern, this idea of in OCD, you know, of kind of relating that to the false comfort and the worry voice, the question now is, how do we actually take this knowledge and then apply it in our day-to-day lives and lessen the grip that OCD has on our lives? And the answer is that the only real way to kind of break free of these patterns and to start feeling better in your day-to-day life is using mindfulness. And that's one component of it. And we're going to talk about how to use mindfulness and how to effectively use it so that you can get better. So the first thing that we need to understand is that when you have these kind of patterns in your head, right, a lot of the times you're completely unaware of what's actually going on. See, at the start of OCD, at the start of anxiety, right? Again, if you think back to your childhood, that trigger behavior response pattern was actually very effective, right? In the beginning, it works really well, right? First, you'll have your trigger, you know, maybe there's some kind of violence or something going on in the home. Maybe there's, you know, parents yelling, maybe parents are stressed. Something happens in the home, right? Then you have your anxiety crop up, and then you think hard, you find a solution, and then your reward is actually that you feel a little bit safer. You feel a little bit better. But in the real world, that no longer is the case, right? Because we're finding problems where there aren't any problems. And same thing with OCD. When you start out with OCD, the voice of false comfort actually does work really well. But it's as time goes on that it becomes less and less effective. And again, this is why it's very similar to things like drug addiction, you know, or, you know, like kind of playing the slot machine over and over again. At the beginning, it's extremely rewarding, right? And then your brain remembers that and it says, okay, this is a good behavior. It's going well now, so So I'm just going to keep doing it. I'm going to forget about the fact that, I'm not going to check if it's going to be good or not. What your brain basically does, right, is you'll have these kind of behaviors, these compulsive behaviors, and you'll notice, okay, this behavior is good, so I'm going to make it a habit, and I'm just going to keep doing it, and I'm going to stop checking if it's rewarding or not. And that's a big important key, right? It stops checking if the behavior is rewarding. So later on down the line, when your anxiety gets a lot worse and, overthinking is no longer helpful, when your OCD gets worse and the false comforts or the compulsive behaviors no longer actually ease your anxiety, right? Even with drug addiction, when the drugs don't work anymore, when the drugs actually make you feel worse than better, right? Your brain has stopped checking. Your brain stops asking, does this actually feel good? Is this actually enjoyable? And because of that, you keep doing it out of habit. That's how habits are made, right? We stop thinking about, is this a behavior I want to do or not? And we just do it anyway. So how do we fix this? We can actually turn that part of our brain back on that's checking to see if this is a rewarding habit or not. And we can do that using mindfulness. So this can kind of be applied really well to smoking. And this is actually what helped me quit smoking, right? What you want to do is you want to actually be mindful of the trigger behavior reward patterns going on and be especially mindful of the reward, right? So let's apply this to smoking first, and then let's move into applying this to OCD and anxiety. So let's say that you have some kind of trigger, right? Typically for me, when I would want to smoke, I would feel stressed, right? I would feel uncomfortable. I'd feel a little on edge. Maybe I was stressed about work. Maybe I was stressed about a relationship or a friendship. Something had me feeling uncomfortable, right? That's the trigger. The behavior is I would smoke, and then the reward would be is that I would, in the beginning at least, would have a feeling of decreased stress or anxiety. But then when I started to become mindful, months into my smoking kind of habits, I decided to kind of really be mindful of the reward. And I realized the reward actually wasn't that good, right? If you actually sit down and mindfully smoke, you'll feel how horrible the cigarette tastes. You'll feel how horrible it feels going into your body. You'll feel the pain in your lungs after you're done, the kind of heaviness that sets in after a cigarette. You'll feel the fact that you actually feel a little bit more anxious. You'll feel that bit of vertigo. You'll feel that kind of upsetness in your stomach kind of hitting, and you'll realize that this isn't that fun to do, and it's not that rewarding. Maybe at a young age, when you start, maybe in your teens or something like that, it's super cool, it's super exciting, and it's it's this kind of rebel bad boy bad girl kind of thing to do. It gives you social status, it makes you seem cool, it takes the edge off, it makes parties a little bit easier. But now none of those rewards are typically there. That's why a lot of people quit in their 30s and 40s, because by that point the rewards that you initially used to get from smoking are no longer there, and you need to become mindful of that, right? So now let's apply this to anxiety, right? So when you were a kid, you would have an anxiety response that was helpful. You'd have some kind of thing happening in your environment, and people who are minorities also face this a lot. They'd go out into public, someone might be kind of committing some kind of atrocity, or they might be doing something wrong because of racism or something like that. You're gonna have someone who's saying something mean to you. You have the fear that you're gonna get kicked out of your white friend's house or something like that if you say the wrong thing. So you have your trigger, you see a problem, your behavior is that you worry about it and you kind of find ways to solve it, and then your reward is that you feel better and you avoid negative consequences most of the time. But again, you're hyper aware, you're over searching for problems where there are no more problems anymore. So notice what actually happens. What you want to do is you want to notice that reward, and you want to notice how it's intermittent, how it only works sometimes, right? You want to notice every time you get worried, what is the actual outcome of my worrying? Does my worrying ever actually solve the problem, or do I just do the thing that I thought of within the first 2 minutes of thinking about it, and the rest of the few multiple hours that I thought about it were kind of a waste? You need to become mindful and aware. So next time you become anxious, right, notice, okay, what was my trigger? What made me actually become anxious? Then notice your behavior. Notice how do you actually cope in your own brain with your anxiety or with your stressor, right? So you might notice, for me, right, I might have like an assignment that I have to do. So that'll be the trigger, right? And then I'll get worried about the assignment, and what I'll do is, instead of actually doing the assignment, right, I'll think about, okay, how can I make it easier for me to do the assignment? What is there that I need to do? Is there a way that I can kind of get out of doing this assignment? All right, when am I going to do it? And I'll just keep on thinking and thinking and thinking about it. And the reward will be is that I'm more stressed and I've made no progress on the assignment, right? And when that finally clicked when I actually saw that happen in real time. I decided to switch the behavior and try something else. Next time I got anxious about, needing to get something done, I was like, okay, let me just do it. Let me just start doing it for 5 minutes and see if I feel better, right? And so I put that timer on for 5 minutes, started doing the thing, and I was like, okay, this isn't so bad. And then I felt a little bit better. And in that moment, I realized the trigger was, the assignment, the stress, the behavior was making progress on the assignment, and the reward was not only did I feel better, but I actually made progress on the assignment, right? So that is kind of what you want to do, is you want to be mindful of that trigger behavior reward and try and replace the behaviors with more healthy behaviors instead. So if you procrastinate because you're a perfectionist, stop worrying about doing things perfectly. Notice the fact that worrying about doing things perfectly and being stressed only makes you more stressed and doesn't make you make any progress on the things that you actually want to complete. Notice the real reward that's at play, right? And then replace that behavior with just making progress, even if it's not perfect, and then see what the reward is. Again, the reward will be that you actually made progress and you may feel a little less stressed. And we can apply this kind of to OCD as well, right? This is a little harder to apply to OCD because it's a lot more anxiety provoking and it takes a bit of time, and it's not as kind of instantaneous. But what you can do is you can notice that you have your obsessive thought, your intrusive thought, something come up, right? And then don't perform your compulsions. And you have to not perform them for an extended period of time, right? And notice what the reward is. And at first, I'll be honest, the reward is that you don't really get a reward. You actually feel horrendous. You actually feel a lot more anxiety and you feel a lot worse. But if you stick with it, right, you have your obsessive thought, whatever, and you wait a couple hours, right, and you try your hardest to not do any compulsions, not do anything at all, eventually what happens is that your anxiety goes down and it normalizes and you become okay again. And the reward that you learn is that, okay, if I don't perform my compulsions, or the less I perform my compulsions, the less anxiety I feel. And this is a slow process. This doesn't happen overnight the first time you do something, right? Habits take a long time to form. OCD takes a long time to form. Anxiety takes a long time to form. It happens throughout your childhood as you're growing up. That's how it happens. It doesn't just happen like that, so you're gonna have to be patient with yourself, but that's the general process, right? You notice the trigger, the intrusive thought, the worry, something's wrong. You notice the behavior, either if it's compulsions or overthinking or getting stuck in thought loops, and then you notice the reward. With OCD, it's easy to notice the kind of negative reward, right? Because after you perform compulsions over and over and over again, you can realize, I feel worse. I feel more anxious. I don't feel any better, and I haven't gotten anything done, and now I'm stressed about other stuff as well. Become mindful of that reward, and keep in mind that at one point, this was a different reward, right? But in the present moment, it's no longer that reward. So that is kind of the fundamentals, to kind of break everything down and summarize the whole video. The way that anxiety basically works is that for normal people, without anxiety, we all have a tendency to kind of notice problems. And then when we notice a problem, our brain gives us a feeling or an emotion in order to drive us to solve that problem, right? And that feeling can be anxiety. But the problem for people who have anxiety disorders is that the problem that they notice either is not a real problem or it can't be solved. In other words, the problem is that they think there's a problem, not the fact that there's actually a problem there. And what basically happens for people with anxiety is that early on in their life, they had this kind of thing going on in their head. They had a trigger, a behavior, and a reward, right? The trigger was that there's some kind of thing that caused them stress within their environment. The behavior was that they got anxious and they worried about it, and the reward actually was positive. It turns out that being anxious in a dangerous environment is helpful, and maybe when they were a child, they were in a dangerous or maybe potentially unsafe environment, and that helped them feel a little bit better and gain some security. But then as an adult, what happens is that the trigger becomes, again, normal day-to-day stresses. The behavior becomes worrying, anxiety, overthinking, and it goes out of proportion. And the reward is that you become actually more anxious and more stressed. However, when you're an adult, it becomes more addicting because occasionally you will get rewarded. The reward will be that you actually do find a solution. Your anxiety might actually be useful sometimes, right? But 90% of the time it's not. But because it's that intermittent reward, it's like a slot machine, so it's super addictive. The way we break free of this pattern is to recognize the trigger, the behavior, and the reward. Recognize what your triggers are, what makes you kind of start to go into an overthinking mode. Recognize, if you have OCD, recognize your obsessions, what thoughts actually trigger you, what thoughts don't trigger you, and then recognize the behavior. How do you respond when there's a stressor? What does your anxiety look like, right? What do your compulsions look like? Are they mental? Are they physical? What do they look like? And then the reward that you want to look at is, what does the reward actually feel like? Remember, at one point, OCD, anxiety, all these things were helpful. The reward actually was that you felt a little bit better. And then your brain was like, okay, looks like we feel good when we do this thing, so we're just going to keep doing it. And I'm going to stop checking if this is an effective behavior or not. Right? But you want to bring that part of your brain back online, and you want to check, is this still an effective behavior? Do I actually feel better when I constantly worry? Do I actually feel better when I perform compulsions over and over again? And if the answer is no, once you experience that and you're mindful of it, you can start to feel a lot better. That's all for this video. I hope that this helps. Thank you so much for watching, and take care.